Welcome to the Wiener Conference Call series. These one-hour, on-the-record phone calls feature leading experts from Harvard Kennedy School who answer your questions on public policy and current events. Wiener Conference Calls recognize Malcolm Wiener's role in proposing and supporting this series, as well as the Wiener Center for Social Policy at Harvard Kennedy School.
Good day, everyone. I am Mari Mejias in the Office of Alumni Relations and Resource Development at Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to this Wiener Conference Call. Today, we are joined by Pippa Norris, who is the Paul F. McGuire Lecturer in Comparative Politics at the Kennedy School. A teacher at Harvard for more than a quarter century, she is a comparative political scientist whose work focuses on democracy, public opinion and elections, political communications, and gender politics around the world. Google Scholar ranks her 5th worldwide in political science citations, and she has published more than 50 books, many translated into dozens of languages. We are so fortunate that she has agreed to share her thoughts today with the Kennedy School's alumni and friends. Pippa, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's always a pleasure, and so much I really appreciate everybody who's come along as well. And what I'm going to do is talk about, in particular, why Republicans don't abandon Trumpism. Now, we all thought after the election that there might be a change in the party. In particular, as we know, the Republicans have lost in the Trump years in terms of the House and the Senate, and of course the White House. So why don't Republicans abandon the philosophy, the ideas under Trump, and move back towards the center ground, towards the Mitt Romney party, towards the party that was there 20 years ago? So what I'm going to do is just give us a theory, median voter theory, which is the way that scholars like to think about these issues. I'm going to talk about the evidence on party polarization and avoid a little bit of the idea that it's on both sides. Yes, the Democrats have become more progressive and have moved somewhat towards the liberal left, but above all, the evidence suggests that it's within the Republican Party which has become more extreme. And then the question is why? What's going on? And here, what I'd really love to hear from are your thoughts about what's changing. It may be to do with the media, it may be to do with society, but I'm going to put forward 4 reasons, which I developed in the op-ed, which I gave for the monkey cage in the Washington Post. Number 1, the electoral incentives for accountability are too weak, so that basically the Republican legislators go for their primary voters, go for the party faithful, but they don't necessarily reach out across the aisle to the independents and the median voters. Secondly, the way in which the law in elections is controlled by the partisans in state houses. So again, instead of expanding their appeal, which is what median voter would suggest, what they do is they change the rules. Thirdly, the argument is that any issues about illiberalism, support for democracy, preferences for strongman leaders go well beyond anything to do with President Trump. The changes started earlier on, before Trump came down the golden staircase, and they continued afterwards. And they're there in the electorate and in the public and in the state houses, as well as in Congress. And then there's institutional inertia. In other words, the incumbents, in particular in Congress, the leadership say, why change? I got elected under the old ways. I can get my supporters to bring me back to Congress, to give me elected office. Why do we need to shift the party? And then there are obviously lots of other reasons as well I won't go into. The conclusions, what is to be done? And here what I'm emphasizing is that we need institutional reforms, changes to the rules of the game. And we know that in over 250 state houses, there are bills which are basically trying to restrict voters' rights. H.R. 1 for the People's Act is the main initiative which the Democrats are advancing, with a range of different reforms. It's very ambitious. Redistricting to become more independent, expansion of voting facilities so that it's much easier to register and to be able to cast a ballot. Campaign finance reform, so there's less dark money, election security, so that there's audits and we have confidence in the results, and government ethics. The problem, of course, is not so much what we do, but how we get it done. And in particular, we've got to confront the issues of the filibuster in the Senate. How do we actually change that? A very tricky issue, and something which we might live to regret in the longer term. Court challenges are going to occur if this does even get through. And then we should think about other changes. For example, the Electoral College won't be changed by H.R. 1. So let's go through some of these arguments and talk about how we can change the system and what the problems are. So first, let's start with the theory. And here we go back in political science. to these ideas. Firstly, when we think about democracy, it is obviously a minimalist version about elections. That's what Trumpism says. In other words, the public make sure that the electors, that the legislators are accountable and people choose their representatives. Anthony Downs in the 1950s said, and rational vote-seeking politicians, those who want office, those who want the ability to do things, will adjust their ideology and their ideas and their values and their policy appeals to win elected office. That's what they want to do. The majority and electoral system, the ways in which we vote in America, means that this should encourage moderate political parties and penalizing third parties. And that again is well established. And there was an electoral shock under Trump's leadership. The GOP lost control of the House and the Senate and the White House, and Trump didn't just lose badly, he lost by 3 million votes in 2016 and 7 million in 2020. So this is the puzzle for all of us to think through. Why, given that defeat, doesn't the Republican Party simply adjust its appeals, move back, for example, support things like the public spending to bring back jobs under the pandemic? Why does it not adjust its views on a range of issues much more towards where the majority of public opinion is in America and shift back towards the center ground? That again would be predicted, but clearly it's not what's happening. So we've got this puzzle. And here again illustrates the nature of the puzzle. It's not simply Trump losing in one election. Look at the record of the GOP in the Electoral College, and they haven't had a landslide since the heady days of the 1980s, the Reagan and Bush era. Since then, as you can see, it's been either very tight or it's just a margin, or the Democrats have won. So they've had a series of defeats. And if we look at the popular vote, and this shows it to you from successive presidential elections, just to bring it back to mind, since 1992, for 2 decades, we've had the Republicans have failed to win a majority of the popular vote. So the shock should be there. The public, we can look at how the public has changed over time. This is from the 1970s, from the National Election Survey. And again, it's pretty obvious if you look at the chart on the left, we've got the overall people who say that they're conservative, which is a large proportion, but it's 4 out of 10. And it hasn't changed that much over time, goes up and down a bit. 4 out of 10 is not enough to win the presidency. The moderates are an important group, and liberals have expanded. So there should be an incentive, as we say. And yet, despite all of that, polarization has got worse. Let me just break off. Tushara, you've raised your hand. Questions about this? We had a hand raised. I don't know if we need to open up and Mona as well. And we're getting lots of hands are opening up before I can say anything more. Please, Tushara, would you like to say something? And I'll change my screen here a little bit. More people. No Q&A yet, is that right? I think we need people to unmute themselves if they're going to ask a question.
Yeah,
Right.
we can go to Q&A if you want to, or if you want to wait until the end. It's up to you.
What we could do, Mari, is just take like 2 questions and then I can go back. That's always nice. It's an interactive format.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Let's see.
It's a bit more lively than my simply talking on when.
Sure.
Tushara, you were first, I think.
Does she have her hand up still?
No, I think not.
Let's see.
If it's a nuisance.
Tushara, you can just unmute yourself and ask your question now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If not, we can move on.
Yeah, let's move on.
Let's move on. While we get the technology there, hold on to your questions and we'll put them all in at the end, and there will be a good chance for a Q&A as we get to that section as well. So what's the problem? Well, party polarization, you all know very well by watching anything going on in the Senate. These are the trends. And this documents it from roll call voting. It's the best source we have, DW nominate, and look at what's happened from the 1980s onwards. As we can see, there was a gap clearly between the major parties, but the Republicans have increasingly moved up towards a more conservative position. The Democrats have moved down somewhat, but again, as Norm Ornstein emphasizes, there's been more change in the Republican Party than there has in the Democratic Party. The blue line and the red line shows you the average score across conservative and liberal values in roll call voting. And I think this is really a way of bringing it back home. Here's what the Senate looked like in the 1950s and what the Senate looks like today. And you can see in the 50s that there was, broadly speaking, many senators in the middle of the ground. And this was when the old Senate used to work. There was deliberation, there was bipartisan discussions, and people would move about on different issues. And what you've got is the economic dimension across the bottom, conservative or liberal, and then the other votes like social and foreign policy, liberal or conservative. And you can see that there were many conservative Republicans, of course, from the once solid South. And again, look on the right-hand column, and you can see the contrast. Are there Susan Collinses of the world? Yes, and Joe Mnuchin, but Ted Cruz and Elizabeth Warren shows the polarization and the gap in the middle. There aren't that many senators in the middle. And of course, the same thing has happened in the House, even more so. And again, that arrow shows you that basically more and more votes have become partisan. Down the line, people are not shifting on the basis of the legislation or their values. And the Republicans have become more conservative and more consistent, more ideologically homogeneous, and the Democrats have still a big tent across the liberal issues, but they have moved to the left as well, and a gap in the middle. And I'm just going to show you this chart to illustrate again some of the polarization that people are not necessarily aware of. This is a survey which I did called the Global Party Survey to put America in comparative perspective. And what we've got is how far parties, and it's a worldwide survey, it's done in 166 countries, but I'm just looking at OECD, where parties place themselves on democracy. So at the bottom is a 10-point scale. Do parties favor or oppose checks and balances on the executive? And then on the vertical axis, do they respect or undermine liberal democratic principles and norms? And you can see where the parties place themselves. And the most important part is where you highlight that the US Democrats, by and large on these issues, is, along with many other Labour, Social Democratic and liberal parties in the European context, the Republican, the GOP, is well up on that side, close to Fidesz with Viktor Orban in Hungary, or the Greek Golden Dawn XA, which has become an illegal party in Greece because they're so extreme, or the Polish Peace and Justice Party, Law and Justice Party, or some of the other parties which are there, which are seen as part of the radical right. For example, Marine Le Pen is the French National Front, FN. So what's happened is that the Republicans have moved to the extreme, and on these issues, on support for democracy, the Democrats remain more or less there. And some estimates suggest that this isn't, again, something which is only about the recent years of 2016, although that has obviously increased illiberal values and illiberal positions. This is some independent evidence from VDEM, based in Stockholm, which looks at how parties have changed from the 1970s, again in countries around the world. And you can see on this estimate of commitment to democratic norms, Democrats, according to this expert evidence, remain flat. Republicans started to change around 2000 in the Florida race and then continued. And again, support for pluralism in the Republicans, according to this evidence, commitment to free and fair elections goes down. Now, why? And what is to be done? Let's briefly say 4 reasons. And the reasons you can think about, there's lots of different literatures, there's lots of different authors, an excellent set of research, people like Ezra Klein, Mo Fiorina, Lee Druckmann, and our own book, Cultural Backlash. But here's the 4 reasons. Electoral incentives, partisan control of state houses, authoritarian values, and institutional inertia. What do we mean by that? Well, first, the institutional incentives. It's about gerrymandering, and it's about party primaries. And what that means is that legislators, candidates, appeal to the party faithful. They don't go out to the more moderate, the suburbs, those who are more flexible and independent. And therefore, donors increase that emphasis, and the party appeals to its base, not the median American. In addition, the biases which are built into the Constitution favor the Republicans. The illustration here is simply of the Senate, showing you the share of senators from the 15 most populous states and the 25 least populous states. And you can see how Republicans are advantaged because, of course, 2 members come from all the rural districts and the rural states, just as they do from New York and California. And the biases we know are there in the Electoral College and in the House. And so that basically means the Republicans don't need to appeal to the median voter because they can work with the rules of the game. Secondly, the Republicans are increasingly trying to restrict voting rights. In reaction to the accusations which were false about fraud, today there are over 250 bills in 43 states which propose restricted voting rights. And you all heard about Georgia, but all the other bills are following along similar lines, shortening early voting, restricting voting assistance, limiting ballot drops, and so on. The Wiener Center is a wonderful resource that documents all of these laws and how they're going through different state houses. And the third reason is that the culture, it's not just what happens in the state houses, but the culture itself has become less liberal, less in favor of democracy, with less confidence in American elections, a long-term slide in support for democracy, and rising support for strongman leaders. What's the evidence? Here's again how the public in America looks at elections and electoral integrity and malpractices in America, compared with how Swedes, those in Norway, those in Finland, those in Austria think about these issues. And what you can see, and this survey was done in the World Values Survey in 2017 in America, before the 2020 accusations about fraud. And even then, Americans have less confidence, and this is the American public, have less confidence in their elections, in their integrity, than most other Western democracies. And the same is true if we look in 2020, and we look at the incidence of fraud. 81% of those who voted for Trump thought there was enough fraud that it was enough to influence the outcome. And this continues as a legacy. So this is the most recent YouGov poll, and it shows today, when asked, did Biden legitimately win the election or not, still 8 out of 10 Republicans and those who voted for Trump said no. So people haven't changed their mind. All of the discussion about electoral fraud and all of those tweets had their impact on those who believed that side. Long-term support for democracy in the World Values Survey has also declined. And again, this is about the American public, not the elites. Those who think that democracy is a very good way of governing has slid from the mid-90s. It went up a little bit in 2017, but not that much. So it's gone down from 90% to 80% at the bottom. And this is really striking. This again is the World Values Survey, rising support for strongman leaders in America. In America, this is the proportion who agree that having a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections is a good thing. 25% in 1995, and 2017, the latest survey we've had in this series, 4 out of 10 Americans. And then lastly, why should Republicans change? Given the views of the public, given the views of their supporters, the new members who've come in have tended to be more Trumpist. Those who've left have often been the moderates. The GOP, after all, gained seats in 2020, and they're likely to gain more seats on average in 2022, the midterms. And the Republicans control state houses. So why change course? So the conclusions, what is to be done? And then we'll come into the Q&A and get your thoughts. And my answer is not to change the media, not to change the culture, which is very difficult to do in any country which wants to have freedom of expression and freedom of thought, but changing elections. And this is HR1 for the People Act. And it really is ambitious. It covers many of the issues which are a problem. Independent electoral commissions should mean the boundaries are fairer, and therefore there's a greater partisan mix in each district. And therefore there'll be incentive for senators, for members of Congress, for the House, to basically make sure that they appeal to across the aisle. Voting rights, making voting easier, increasing turnout. And national voter registration standards, because it should not depend if we're saying one vote for everybody, it should be equal. So how you register shouldn't vary from Texas to Massachusetts or from New York through to Florida. Campaign funding needs a major overhaul. The FEC is broken, the Federal Electoral Commission, which looks after campaign funding, and the super PACs are dark money and they need to be more transparent. Election security should be addressed. Things like audits are a simple way, an administrative way to do that, to make sure on a random basis that we check a certain number of ballots against the results, and government ethics to get over corruption. But of course, the public, when you look at the public support, tends to support many of these initiatives. The problem is, how do you get this through the Senate? It's already gone through the House, given the filibuster, a major challenge. If you do get it through, what happens in the courts? Because the number of litigious challenges is going to be enormous. And what about other major reforms like ranked choice voting or multi-member districts? So American democracy is in a fundamental challenge. HR1 improves elections if it could ever get through. But of course, as the image says, it's a tremendous lift to do this. And the party, the Republican Party, after wavering immediately after the insurrection, has now gone solidly back, I'd argue, towards Donald Trump, who continues to be still the major leader. And the criticism of Donald Trump has been much more muted than it ever was at the time of the insurrection. So let's open up. Let's think about the questions. Let's think about how we can address some of these issues. And I'd really love to hear from you about what you think to be both the problems that cause that party polarization, and then above all, what solutions you think might work. Please, Murray.
Great. So I think Dr. Mona Dorsonville had a question. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask your question. Dr. Mona. Let's go to the next question. Is, let's see, Rick. You are up, Rick Crochalis. If you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Actually, I do not have a question, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
I obviously persuaded everybody, that was good.
How about Karen? Do you have a question?
I do. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for that very interesting talk. You talked about the factors behind the GOP's shift to the farther right. There's been sharp increase in sharp growth in income inequality in the US in recent decades, with the rich getting richer and taking greater control of the Republican Party through super PACs, through foundations. There's been lots written about this. And I wonder if you think that this is one of the factors behind the pull to the further right, and the extent to which even HR1, to the extent that they're dictating, here's what we need to do, and somehow everybody's following along. What do we do? I mean, income inequality isn't going away. Whether we can get rid of their power remains to be seen. Thank you.
So thank you, Karen. And obviously there's ways to think about the relationship. For me, income inequality is as much a consequence as it is a cause. In other words, it's because of these ways in which the Republican Party is basically accountable to its rich donors and to its own faithful, to the MAGA base, on the hot button issues, things like gun control and abortion and issues of gay marriage and a wide variety of other social issues which it appeals to. So because they appeal to those groups and not to the median voter, they will basically also bring in massive tax cuts, as we saw was the major initiative under the Trump years, which will benefit corporations and the donors and those who are more affluent. Is it a cause, however, of their moving to the right? And what's really interesting is if you look at things like who voted for Trump, both in 2016 and in 2020, in fact, it wasn't necessarily those who are the most well off, nor was it those who were the least well off. It was kind of those in the middle who were often Republican voters and Trump supporters. So in the electorate, does income inequality mean that you either become more insecure and therefore will support the Republican Party, or that because you're better off, you're going to support the Republican Party? Not so much in the electorate, but clearly the ways in which income inequality has been exacerbated through the corporate tax cuts is a major consequence of this shift towards the right. But again, I think it's the cultural issues which are pushing it more than the economic issues. And we'll have to see, I think, Karen, about your last comment about whether income inequality is ever going to reverse. Clearly, under the Biden administration, the COVID Relief Act is going to make an important impact, I think, on certain aspects. Things like child support. In Europe, everybody who has children in families normally gets automatically some sort of child support. That's in the bill. Clearly, other things, for example, the minimum wage, weren't in the bill and they didn't get included. But Biden, I know, is trying to push infrastructure. And if that produces a wide range of different blue-collar jobs in the green industries, and it really manages to stimulate the economy, then again, there are opportunities, I think, in the first 2 years for Biden to move towards more income equality. They'll never get back to where they were in the 1990s, you know, because things have got so much worse, but they can tip the needle back. And as we also saw, finally, in the public opinion polls, overwhelming support for the COVID Relief Act amongst the general public, who really felt more confidence in Congress, as well as approving of some of the ideas that were in that bill. So we'll have to see how this plays out in the next couple of years.
Great, thank you. David Calvert, you're up next. If you want to let us know your Kennedy School affiliation and ask your question.
Yeah, I was mid-career in 1997. And thank you, Dr. Norris. That was a great presentation. I really fully agree with every single thing you said. I have a question, but first I'd like to take 60 seconds just to describe what they have in Mexico in terms of the Electoral Commission and so forth. In Mexico, and some may know this already, but in Mexico, they have a national commission that's bipartisan that runs every election. So it's not by state. There's 35 states in Mexico, but they have one national commission and all the rules apply to all the elections in all the country. So it's one set of rules. Secondly, they have a 6-month campaign period. So they don't have this 3 years of campaigning, just a focus on. Thirdly, it's completely publicly financed. So every party gets the same amount to spend. And they don't allow personal donations from people or companies or anybody. And fourthly, fifth, they have a paper ballot that can be recounted if it needs to be. I mean, they just have a really good structure that we could just take and apply in this country and be great, in my view. But anyway, that's just a thought. My question is on the 250 legislative initiatives by the Republicans around the 43 states. Right. Would that be knocked out of the block by HR 1, by S1 if it gets passed, or what would be the sequence in then eliminating those measures through S1?
So David, absolutely. And the example you give of Mexico, which I visited, is really a brilliant example. They do a lot of training, by the way, for many Latin American countries because they have had such a professional service. But of course, it's also there in Canada. Elections Canada does an incredibly good job. Also a country which is enormous with provinces. But the central issues about how you give certain standards, who should register, or how money should be transferred, or how districts should be done, is done through a central agency. Similarly in Australia, similarly in the United Kingdom. So most countries of the world have a National Election Commission. There are, however, David, some potential problems about that as well. In other words, you really need to set it up in a way which is non-partisan, which is independent in all sorts of aspects, like how people get appointed or how they get funds, who they're accountable to, which has to be a complex issue, but has to go towards Congress and so on. Because you could also imagine how you had a National Election Commission that made things worse rather than better. For example, by restricting voting if a particular party took over that commission. But I do agree that having national standards makes a lot of sense. Why should you have different hours of voting if you go from one place to another in America? It does not make sense. Why should you have different ways of registering or casting your ballot? It's confusing for everybody. And so national standards, there again, by the way, was the Electoral Assistance Commission set up in 2002 in America, but all that really does is provide some advice. It is not with any binding commitments to the states. So the states have improved their practice, but they're not regulated. So I think your suggestion of Mexico is really important. And secondly, what would happen if HR 1 gets passed, and then what would happen in the state houses? And of course, you know the answer, which is lawyers would have a field day. They always do in all of these issues. And this again is a problem, because as soon as you get challenges in the courts, then this undermines public confidence, whether it's on the left or the right, or liberal or conservative. The more things get litigious, and the more you get changes, which are pretty rapid. You may remember in the run-up, of course, to 2020, we had a lot of states where some fundamental issues were challenged in the courts, and they flipped back and forth, depending on which court was making a decision. And so it leads to uncertainty and a sense that there's fiddling, if you like, a manipulation of the rules of the game. So the more that we question the rules, and it's become a partisan issue, not a bipartisan issue, the more problematic it's going to be. And it's ultimately going to be the Supreme Court, which is going to have to sort all of this out. And the states are going to say states' rights, that core argument, which they've always had. And there is some legitimacy for that if you read the constitutional requirements and then precedent. On the other hand, there's also certain precedents for the federal government setting certain standards, as we know, of voting rights. Think about the civil rights of the 1950s, to make sure that everybody has a right to vote and that basic democratic principles are not violated by Georgia or anywhere else for that matter.
Great, thank you very much for that question and answer. Roxanne, you are up next.
Hello, Pippa. Roxanne from the Women's Leadership Board.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I have two comments that I would like you to comment on. One is, and certainly this is my view, that we now have democratic control or democratic supporters in control of social media and our opinion guardians, it looks like, which I think I'm terribly concerned about free speech. And I think this leads to some of the work that Putnam has just done with his new book, in which he actually, talks about the 1950s where there was so much alignment and improvement for society in general, and that this polarization is so destructive to democracy. And I just wondered, he is optimistic that society, not per se government, but that society can actually step forward and try to depolarize.
Right.
And I just wondered if you could comment on that, and with the view in mind that what drives social media from some of the latest studies, for example, with MIT, that really it's a very small number of people that are driving the perception that everybody believes what they believe.
Yep. So Roxanne, I mean, obviously it's a critical issue. I'm totally with you on free speech and freedom of expression. We need to preserve that in America. On the other hand, as we also know, that there's such polarization in particularly social media through social media bubbles, and that permeates to society as a whole. And it leads to social intolerance and a lack of trust of others. And my book, which is with Ron Inglehart, very much emphasizes that this isn't just something which is about the communication format, nor is it just something about the leadership. It's actually rooted in society. Because of course, America is not the only country going through this polarization. You can look at Germany, and you look at the Alternative for Germany, a radical right party. You can look at Norway, some of the most progressive countries in the world, Sweden, and they have a radical right parties or authoritarian populist parties. You can look at Britain, and again, they have that. So essentially what's happened is that authoritarian populist parties have come along in many countries of the world, with all different types of media systems, by the way, and they've responded to the rise of cultural concerns. So over the years, our long-term argument in our book is that in the 1950s and 60s, often it was the bread and butter issues about the economic management which divided parties. It was issues about, do you want a greater role for markets in terms of Reaganism and Thatcherism, or do you want a greater role for welfare and the state, Keynesian planning? What's happened over time, and it started in the 80s and continued ever since, is that cultural issues have increasingly become important. And the trouble with cultural issues is you can't divide them up very easily. Issues of race, issues of gender, issues of cosmopolitan multiculturalism, issues of nationalism, issues about patriotism. These are issues which people feel passionately about. They're people's identities, and they feel basically they're zero sum. If one side wins, the other side loses. And so these long-term changes have polarized us in many, many countries and led to the rise of these parties, which have exacerbated it, and the media, which has fed into it as well. There wouldn't be a Breitbart News if there wasn't a demand for Breitbart News. There wouldn't be a CNN or MSNBC if there wasn't a demand for a liberal media as well. So these are changes in society. Putnam, as you say, has addressed these for many years now and thought about how we can think about coming together versus being apart. I must say that when I listen to, again, President Biden, I do think he must have read Bob Putnam, or at least is closely aligned, because again, he often speaks this language. When he speaks about the pandemic, he talks about us together, the language of cooperation and of a community, not a language of isolation and individualism. How we get back to this sense of social tolerance, we don't have time for here. I am writing a new book, however, which is on many of these topics. It's for Oxford University Press, and it's called In Praise of Skepticism. It's about social trust and political trust, and it starts to address some of these issues. How do we manage to get more of a sense of us versus a sense of them, and putting other groups and other identities beyond the pale, people you can't talk to, you can't deliberate with, you can't discuss. And so how do we actually, how we do that complex issue? Hopefully we'll have another seminar that might manage to address that maybe in further years, and we'll see how, whether the Biden administration has managed to make some of those overtures and attract many more moderate groups to its side as well.
Great, thank you very much. Lucy, you are up next.
Hi, thank you, Pippa. This has been really grand. I've been doing a lot of research on the nature of right-wing extremism and fundamentalism, which ties in, and your last comments actually tie in as well.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear you talk more about none of your research that you presented today has any racial breakdown. And we know here in the United States the sad truth that the majority of white men voted for Trump twice. And that part of the radicalization that we've seen is that the Republican Party has gone herring off ever farther into right field, has been that the party has indeed become the party of white supremacy. And I'd like to hear you talk more about that. Certainly the insurgency that we saw on January 6th was a reflection of white supremacy. There was some polling that was done after 2016 that showed that, you know, while there was an initial kind of noises that was made that it was economic distress that was causing people to vote for Trump. Instead, it was fear of a loss of social standing by white men in the face of the advancement of Blacks and people of color and of women. And certainly the occasion of having a Black man in the White House occasioned a flip out from which we're still reeling. The other dimension that's come up, and I don't think you can separate it, is the issue of religious affiliation.
Yeah.
And I want to know if you've done any research about the very scary ascendancy of Christian nationalism and the Christian nationalist movement, and the degree to which the Republican Party is not only a white nationalist movement, but a Christian nationalist movement, and that overlap in terms of where we're going, and in terms of how we begin to address basically disempowering the current Republican Party. It seems to me would be part of my strategy. And as far as I'm concerned, they need to be ground into, they need to be sort of chased off to the left field as the minoritarian, intolerant, undemocratic scam that they are.
Yes.
So I would like to hear you talk more about those two dimensions. I know that Heather McGee has done a lot of work about looking at the racial dimension of everything. So if you could talk a little bit more about then the sort of the racial dimension, which also includes the gender dimension, and then also the religious affiliation piece of this, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
So Lucy, you're absolutely right in everything you're saying about the issue of race in America in particular. And so that's been a fundamental cleavage, but of course it's not new. If you look back to the 1990s, right through the 80s, 90% or 80% between that figure, depending on the president, of African Americans would vote Democrat. And so there's always been a cleavage of race as fundamental, obviously, in America along party lines. And that's happened ever since Harry Truman essentially started to change the Democratic Party, along with Lyndon Johnson, who followed, and lost the South as a result of that. So the realignment of race as a long-term trend into two different parties has been an issue. On the other hand, we have to say that there are also many other factors which have been characteristic of support for the Republican Party. So it's partly about race. It's also about other issues of age. One of the interesting factors is that the older population in particular is the ones who support Trump. The younger population, even with a Biden, who of course is not a spring chicken, shall we say, even with an older candidate, still overwhelmingly goes towards the Democratic Party. So generations are pulling apart, as well as ethnic groups. And it's also other types of identity are equally important. So issues of gay rights and homosexuality and equal rights to marriage, issues of gender and misogyny have again reared their head. Issues of anti-Semitism, again, issues that you might have thought were there from the 1950s and again are becoming salient, for example, throughout Europe. Anti-Muslim views, as well as Islamophobia, has again become more salient. So it's about this cultural politics, which is us, them, and who is us and who is them, and the way that we put people into boxes as a result of their identities, and the way in which that then gets translated into the parties. So in the 1950s, you remember that sorting image that we had of the Senate. The liberals, the party of Lincoln was in the Republican Party in the North, and the Southern Party in the Democrat Party was the Jim Crow Party, was the Confederate Party. So the parties have sorted, as many people have said, geographically, and they've sorted by groups. And those groups are problematic in the sense they're kind of fixed identities. Again, class or income or economic inequality you can fix by adjusting a bit. You can increase, as being proposed right now, progressive taxation on the most affluent groups and corporations. And you can improve welfare and you can improve benefits, for example, for children to relieve child poverty, an amazing reform that's gone through more sotto voce in the latest COVID Act. But you can't change people's identities. And clearly on a range of issues, many Republicans genuinely feel that they're under real threat. And it's not simply they're being told they're under threat, but they are under threat because that group of rural Americans, evangelicals, those who are religious, those who are based with less education, and those who have an older profile, that group is the group that's declining. And it is the urban, more diverse populations, the younger populations, the more educated who have been expanding. And so that group in rural America, again, we often think, oh, it's just Trump telling people they should be fearful about these threats, or it's just Republicans telling them, or it's just the media telling them. No, no, no. They are under threat from many of the elite institutions. Think about the values of Hollywood, think about the values of Harvard for that matter, think about the values of the New York Times. They're under threat in their core values that they think are important and in their identities. And again, if you threaten somebody's identity, they're going to push back, whether you're Black, under the issues of Black Lives Matter, whether you're Hispanic, whether you're a woman, whether you're gay, whatever your identity is. So it's happened in America that identity politics has come to the fore, which makes deliberation much more difficult. And it happens under Brexit in Britain, between the Leaves and the Remainers. It happens in France, it happens in Germany, it happens in Italy, it happens in Hungary, it happens in Venezuela, it happens in many countries where authoritarian populists have essentially taken up these issues, immigration in particular, and race in particular, and said, we're the party that will stand for you. Remember when Trump said, trust me, I'm the party who's going to basically represent your views, who's going to articulate your views. Nobody else will. So it's an appeal through their rhetoric, which has been very powerful. And then how the other parties respond is a really tricky thing. Do they take on board those issues and try to deal with them in a more reasonable way? Well, certainly some parties have tried to do that, for example, in the Netherlands or in Germany, Angela Merkel. Or do they try to say, keep them at a distance? So you've got a strategy of pariah, where you just don't engage in those issues and those policies, and you try to exclude them. Or an issue of essentially co-option or parroting, where you take their issues on board and try to reduce the support. But how you do that is very tricky and can easily backfire. And I think you said at the end, Lucy, that we should basically exclude those groups in the Republican Party. Well, yes, but America obviously needs two parties, right? So it's just not as easy. We have to somehow reach out and work out what can be done on electoral reform, on infrastructure, on COVID relief, or anything else which can overcome some of the deep divisions in Congress and deep divisions in the electorate. And just the last thought, I think that in particular, President Biden has been astute and experienced in doing this, because what he does is he often has quite radical policies in terms of an incredibly ambitious set of agendas for the first COVID relief, 3 trillion proposed for the infrastructure, including environmental climate change, and this issue of HR1 that would radically change the elections. But he speaks in a very moderate, non-controversial, reaching out sort of way. So in some ways, he's the un-Trump. Trump spoke in a very radical way, but in fact, in practice, because so much was through executive orders, he didn't actually manage to achieve that much that was radical through legislation. And Biden is, of course, the opposite, achieving enormous amount through the first COVID Act. We'll have to see how he goes in the next 2 years, but speaking in a very moderate tone, not in the tone of Elizabeth Warren, not in the tone of Bernie Sanders, although clearly the party as a whole has moved in a more progressive direction on the economy as well. So and very interesting issues, and race is central to everything in American politics, Lucy, of course.
Great. Thank you very much for that question and insight. Our next questioner is Harut Manoukian. If you'd like to ask your question, let us know your Kennedy School affiliation as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor. It's Harut Manoukian, MPA class of 2019. Thank you so much, Professor, for preparing me to work on electoral reform. I'm in Armenia now, and I wanted to comment a little bit about the implications of HR1. So in Armenia, things like mail-in voting and even advanced voting are not even in the cards because of the post-Soviet legacy, because of the low trust in government. Nobody really trusts the ballots to be stuck in a room overnight without observers watching them. And since you mentioned that 8 out of 10 Republicans think that electoral fraud changed the result of the election, I was wondering if you could comment on how these much needed changes to expand voting access will impact sort of what kind of reaction will we see coming from the Trump base?
So Harriet, you're absolutely right, because when people are afraid of fraud, for good reason or bad, because they've been told that or because it's real, it doesn't really matter. If they believe that, you have to address that. You can't simply just blithely assume that it can be reversed. So I've always felt that, in fact, there was a lot of middle ground on electoral reform of procedures, that the Democrats who fear things like, for example, voting cards, where you have to have an ID when you go to the polls. Well, many countries do that. For example, India, you get a photo ID in 800 million people in that country when they have an election. You go to the polls and the poll worker will look down the list and there's the photo of the person that they can check off. and it's free. So the essential point is how you administer the electoral security measures that you use. There should not be barriers. You should not just use existing things like driving licenses, which some people may have, others may not. But you really have to have an effective form of electoral registration, which is national, with a single way of making sure that people have access at no cost, and that they are on that register in an accurate way, and the register itself is verified through standard methods, which we know about in many other countries. Again, as you say, this isn't rocket science. This is something we know how to run elections. We know how to do this in countries which have got far more problems than the United States. For example, the UN, when I was in the UNDP, heading up their governance area, ran an election in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country which has had a civil war for 30 years, with bloodshed between warring troops, and with an enormous country the size of Belgium without an infrastructure. Well, the election had some problems, but by and large, the basics of it, how to run an election on things like voter ID, voter security, we know how to do that. The problem is that there has to be enough bipartisan willingness to say, look, security is a problem for Democrats as well. If you get elected and nobody believes you've been elected fairly, that's a problem, I'm afraid. Doesn't matter if you think it's wrong, it's a problem. Similarly, Republicans have to say, well, some of the reforms aren't necessarily things which are only designed to benefit Democrats. If we can expand our appeal, if we can make sure that we appeal to the middle class and to those who are in the suburbs and to the women who are independent and to the floating voters who are not particularly partisan affiliated, and we expand our appeal, then expanding turnout can benefit us as well. So in the current partisan climate, it's difficult to do. But if you can try to change the institutional incentives, you can basically make sure there's a bit more compromise on both sides, so that both sides come to realize, even with the bitterness which there is, it's not as divided as many other countries. And so there are still ways to get people around the table. And there's a simple idea, for example, of independent boundaries. What does that mean? California and 5 other states which have done this, what they've done is simply say that it can't be that you're a lawmaker, so you can't be a legislator who's an incumbent, and you do have to have bipartisan control. So the Republicans can put forward 5 members of a commission, the Democrats can put forward 5 members, and you can also bring in members from civic society who are not affiliated to represent that moderate middle, the independents. And many other countries, again, know how to do this. And we know how to do this. But the political will has been lacking for all the reasons I talked about. In other words, if the Republicans feel they can get elected anyway, and the Democrats think, well, we can get elected too in our own districts, there hasn't been enough incentive to think about how the rules of the game could be improved. And America, let me emphasize just lastly, is 30, 40, 50 years behind, because many other countries have been forced to change. If you're in Armenia, a country with tremendous corruption and division, then independent electoral commissions and a whole range of other reforms have been brought in with the result of the help of the international community and bipartisan consensus. And it works in countries like Ghana, in countries like Nigeria, in countries like Costa Rica in Latin America, or in reforms which have been brought in the Philippines. I mean, there's lots of examples around the world, and America, I think, should learn from some of those and learn from, the Elections Canada, Elections Australia, the UK Electoral Commission, and all the rest. What's the best practice? Let's bring some of those views in to our debates and learn what works and what doesn't work. So thank you very much, Harut. I very much agree with you that we need bipartisan reforms as well.
Great, thank you for that question and answer. Stephen Gessner, it's your turn.
Yes, I'm wondering to what degree you think education has played a role in the failure to prepare people to be citizens and Democrats with a small d.
Yes.
We don't teach critical thinking skills anymore, or maybe we do, but we don't teach them sufficiently.
That's right.
We don't teach debate. We don't teach how to respectfully disagree with other people. And I see that as a failure of our educational system. I'm wondering if you see that as an important role in this, what's happened to our democracy.
Yes. I mean, Stephen, I very much agree. And obviously all of us involved in education agree with that as well, that civics can be meaning different things. So it can mean, quote, how a bill becomes law. In other words, the kind of mechanics, but that doesn't necessarily give you the civic skills of how to think about these issues, how to be critical about media coverage, how to work out for yourself what some of the values and ideas are of different parties or candidates, or how to engage as a participant, not just as an observer or somebody who votes every 4 years or every 2 years. So civics is something which has to be taken on board. And again, there are examples from other countries about teaching civics. So think about a country with no experience whatever of elections or democracy, which suddenly has to have on a massive basis illiterate populations, populations who have no awareness of how the processes work. So countries have developed civics as part of the core curriculum in schools. And they've done this in a way which has been, I think, really pretty illuminating. And the word which you mentioned, which is critical skills, I think we have to do, not just in schools in America, but also even very much at Harvard, that many participants come in and students come in and they have a particular perspective on parties and on issues. And they're often told how to communicate those, how to be persuasive, how to advocate, but teaching them also how to be critical about those values and how to know their own ideas back to front and how to take account of the other side. And learning the skills of a lawyer, essentially. For example, if a student comes in and they're very strongly Democrat, they're very strongly in favor of particular issues, can you ask them to, in class, defend the other side? And to have a group where they actually have to stand for the opposite perspective and really articulate that in very effective ways. So interactive learning, skills which you can't learn from a textbook. It's not about knowledge with a small K, but a deeper set of how you get engaged. Those I think should be brought into the schools and brought into the classrooms and brought into the things that we teach as well at the Kennedy School. And again, just between ourselves, I don't think the Kennedy School does enough of a good job on that basis as well. We often can end up, through teaching advocacy, reinforcing rather than asking students to think, to be critical, not just to fill out the answer, which is what they often do when they're given a project set, but rather to think about what the answer means when they do a data analysis or where they do a case study or where they think about a particular reading or a particular op-ed or whatever it is. To think in the other person's shoes is a very difficult skill for all of us, basically. But teaching that, I think, is absolutely vital. I agree with you very much, Stephen.
Great, thank you very much. We have time for one more quick question. Rosemary Day, it's your turn.
Hi, Pippa. Thank you for the lecture. I think you touched on this a bit, but I just wanted to go back to the generational differences because I am struck by the polling on young people being much less conservative. And could you just speak a little more to those trends and whether, for those of us who would like to not see a return of Trump, does that bode well at all, or am I putting too much stock in those polls?
So the heart of our book on cultural backlash was about the generational changes. And Inglehart, my colleague, my co-author, has always argued that the younger generation and the more educated generation had very different values to their parents and their grandparents. And the differences were very much on, again, the social issues, the cultural issues. For example, a sense of being part of the world and cosmopolitan as being really important, not just being a nationalist or a patriot, being part of the world of Europe, for example, or being able to travel and work in different places, being comfortable with diversity. It's incredible the population diversity of the young, who are essentially around the 50% white population in America, and it's going to become within 2045, whites are going to be the minority amongst the youngest generation. So they're going to grow up with racial diversity and ethnic diversity and all sorts of diversity around them. And they change in their ideas of sexuality, of gender fluidity. They're very comfortable with all of those ideas and ideas of rights and ability to expressions. And then differences in terms of what they expect to do with the environment and climate change and the importance of that for so many young people and how that is the critical issue of our times. So young people and old people have got different values from the time they grow up. As you get demographic change, ultimately the world is going to become, and societies in affluent countries are going to become the more progressive and the more liberal values. And they're going to take over just because the older generation who are more religious, more patriotic, and more nationalistic, and more focused on the old values are going to gradually decline. But it's a long transition and it's not going to happen overnight. And in the short term, you have to say, well, if there has been that trend towards younger generations who are more liberal and growing tolerance of a variety of different lifestyles, why Trump? And our argument in the book is simply that the older generation is still large enough, particularly in the electorate because they vote, to be essentially a tipping point. They were the 60% of those in America in the 1950s and 60s. Now they've turned into the 50%. And in the electorate, they're slightly more because they vote. Young people are passionate about politics. They demonstrate, they protest, they get engaged, but they don't necessarily vote. And that's a universal pattern in nearly every country. And so once that young group expands and once they enter their middle age and start to vote more, then we're likely to see a generational shift in our values, but that's going to take 20 or 30 years. It's not going to happen overnight. Meanwhile, those who've lost out from these changes, profound social changes, are feeling angry and unrepresented, and that the media don't represent them. Harvard and the elites certainly don't represent them. And then they get a leader who says, well, I do. I can be politically incorrect. I don't care. I can be masculine in my values. I can be traditional in terms of my views about race. I can say things which are seen as not politically correct. And so authoritarian populists in many countries around the world have got support, just like Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Erdogan in Turkey, issues of Viktor Orban in Hungary, or different parties like Marine Le Pen in France. So they've appealed to the older generation. And they're going to have a shrinking base, but for the time being, that group votes. And so mobilization is critical. If we can get young people to vote, that's great. But by and large, young people are geographically mobile. They're not fixed in a constituency. They haven't quite created the neighborhood ties that allow you to vote or encourage you to vote. More people do vote under recent elections, more young people, and that's great, but it's going to have to continue. So if the Democrats can turn out their vote and turn out the vote of young people in the 2022 elections, then perhaps they'll hold on to the House. If they don't, then the likelihood is that the House is going to go towards the Republicans because it's so tight. On average, the party in government normally loses about 27 members in every midterm election. So then you're going to have Biden able to do some things through executive action, just like President Trump does, but the House could be lost. The Senate could easily be lost, obviously, because it's so tight already. And then we'll be back to much more gridlock in how we're going. So young people, tell them all to vote. I tell them all to vote all the time. They don't always listen to me. But if you have any opportunity to talk to young people, tell them to vote because their values matter. If they don't, the climate is not going to get improved. And their opportunities to work abroad are not going to help. Patterns of racial diversity and equality and justice are not going to improve. Women are going to have to go back, as we've seen already from the pandemic, in terms of their position in the workforce. They're being forced back. Violence in the home is increasing, especially domestic violence. And certain issues that we thought had been settled in the 1950s. I mean, we all thought civil rights was, we were kind of complacent. We kind of thought that things changed. And yet we find in Georgia and in all the other states that you can't take anything for granted. You have to fight. You have to be committed. You have to work with others. You have to create a coalition. You have to expand. You have to advocate and get things through. Otherwise, I can see that American democracy is under threat. American elections are under threat. And the American societies that we hope for in a progressive future is under threat. That's a dark note to finish on. I do apologize, guys. I know I should really end up on a much more optimistic note. But the optimistic note is maybe that things are changing fast under Biden. So we'll see how the next 2 years work out and come back and talk to you all and really have your views and opinions after 2 years, and we'll see where we are at that stage. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate the Q&A. I really appreciate all of you coming, and I've really enjoyed an opportunity to talk about some of these ideas. And do contact me if you'd like further information. I've got lots of different research projects all relating to these issues. Pippa Norris at Harvard EDU, obviously, Pippa N15 on the good old Twitter, and then pippanorris.com for my other information, papers, research, and things like that. Thank you all very much. And thank you very much also to the organizers. I really appreciate it. And the Dean's Council and Alumni Relations. You are the heart and soul of the Kennedy School. We rely on you so much for all of your inputs and ideas and suggestions. Do come back to me for anything we haven't had a chance to talk about. And I really look forward to further engaging with all of you if we can. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much to you, Pippa, for sharing your expertise this morning. Apologies that we didn't get to everyone's questions, Just like to note that our next call will be held April 15th with Professor Eric Rosenbach, who's also an HKS alum, MPP 2004, who will focus on U.S. national security during the Biden administration. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a great day.